Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, hope you've all been doing well. With AMD's new Ryzen 3000 series CPUs hitting the market soon, with new information being released almost daily now, as we get closer to July 7th, I wanted to go over some of that information, give my thoughts on it, and also discuss why I believe that these new desktop CPUs look like a very compelling upgrade for first gen and even second gen Ryzen owners. As with every passing day with new bits of info, Ryzen 3rd Gen appears to be getting better and better. For starters, looking at what was shown at E3, they went over some of the information they had already established from Computex 2019, where they went over the lineup and talked about price points. Now, while they had given out information regarding the Ryzen 5 SKUs previously at Computex, they never really got to highlight them in the show. Only the tech press got that information, and later it was relayed to everyone else. So Lisa did take this opportunity to talk about the Ryzen 5 3600 and the 3600X. The processors are geared towards the mid-range budget market. Both processors have the same core and thread count, but differ in clock speeds. And you can already guess, judging from the X variants of the previous gen, that the 3600X has a higher base and boost clock. The Ryzen 5 3600 will be $199 while the 3600X will be $249. So if you're looking for a really solid gaming CPU that won't really break the bank, the Ryzen 5 family is looking like a really solid choice here. They did show a slide where they compared the gaming performance of the 3600X to the i5 9600K, which is another CPU that is catered towards those users who want a good and fast processor that they'll be using mostly for gaming. And from the looks of it, AMD's new 6-core part is quite competitive with the 9600K from Intel, where in games, both of these processors are trading blows with one another. However, a major selling point for the 3600X will be the fact that it also has simultaneous multi-threading enabled for a total of 12 threads usable. Therefore, if you do a little bit of content creation or some streaming here or there, those 6 extra threads will definitely go a long way for you, whereas the 9600K will be limited in those scenarios with just the 6 threads. They've also showcased the 3800X's performance against the 9700K, and the two can also be seen as trading blows with each other. But just like the 3600X, the 3800X offers much better multi-threading performance, which opens the door to allow users to dive into other areas of computing which can require a lot of threads. And in case you weren't aware, Intel disabled hyperthreading on its i7s for this ninth generation. The same thing was shown for the 9900K, Intel's best gaming processor on the market, going against AMD's new 12-core processor, the Ryzen 9 3900X. Both processors show comparable gaming performance like the previous two comparisons. We'll obviously have to wait for independent benchmarks until reviewers can get their hands on the chips to validate the information presented by AMD. However, it looks like when it comes to gaming, AMD is finally on that same level as Intel, and I believe that when benchmarks from third parties are out, most of the results people will get should, for the most part, line up with what we're seeing here, as AMD really is making quite the emphasis this time around to actually showcase CPU performance in games. You can just tell by their selection of games. A lot of the titles chosen are single-core dependent games like CSGO and PUBG. In both of those titles, if these benchmarks are to be believed, AMD are actually just slightly ahead. Back when AMD held their new Horizon gaming event in 2016, prior to Ryzen Gen 1 launch, they did a demonstration where they had an 8-core Ryzen 1st Gen processor going head-to-head against the 6900K from Intel in Battlefield 1, which is a fairly CPU-dependent game as well. However, their demonstration was done at 4K, which absolutely made zero sense because you're just going to be incurring a total GPU bottleneck there, so it defeated the whole purpose of a CPU showcase. I'm really happy to see that 1080p performance is what was focused on here. This is because for Zen 2, I was really hoping this would be one of the main areas they would improve in significantly, and it looks like they have. One of the demos AMD did, which was also met with a lot of criticism for being quote-unquote misleading, was that they also showcased the 3900X and 9900K in a streaming scenario, where the preset was set at a high-quality slow preset, and the result was that the 3900X handled it like a pro while the 9900K was having absolutely none of it. It struggled to deliver even just 2% of the frames. Personally, I had no issue with this demo. Yes, the 9900K is totally capable of streaming like any other 8-core processor, like the 1800X or 2700X. Nobody is doubting that. The point of this showcase was that the 3900X can handle the quality preset that the 9900K simply cannot. A company is showing their product in a scenario where they beat their competitor in. That's all there is to it. It's a selling point, one which quite a lot of people will find appealing, especially if you are a streamer but don't want to deal with multiple machines dedicated for streaming and one for just gaming. You can maybe call it a little unrealistic, as you can drop the quality preset and things will be just fine and acceptable for the 9900K, but misleading? I don't think so, as the preset was clearly stated. If they had showcased the demo saying outright that the 9900K can't stream but our product can, then yeah, that would have been misleading and awfully poor, as they'd be basically shitting on their own 8-core products as well, but that wasn't the case. Therefore, in terms of gaming, reaching parity with Intel is huge for them because they've already overtaken them in all other areas. I mean, previously, the only reason why I'd be inclined to recommend Intel to anybody was if they A, had money to blow, and B, wanted the absolute highest gaming performance. Single-core performance was pretty much the only deficit AMD had to cover. Multi-threading performance was already better on Zen. AMD had increased their IPC with Zen 2 by approximately 15% over Zen Plus. Along with that, there was a significant uplift in frequency due to the newer and smaller 7nm HPC node from TSMC, but this isn't the only area where they improved in. Compared to the previous generation, they have made strides in many other areas as well. Memory overclocking is another area where they have improved in upon drastically, and again, I was really happy to see this, as this was another area that was a disaster on launch for first-gen Ryzen. There were countless reports of people not being able to simply set XMP profiles, not attaining advertised clock speeds of their memory kits, having to loosen timings to even be able to successfully boot. There were just quite a lot of difficulties to working with RAM and Ryzen. And these weren't even extreme frequencies or anything that people were trying to shoot for. Simply trying to get to 2800 MHz or 3000 MHz RAM with decent timings was almost impossible for some. RAM compatibility did improve over time, and things got a lot better with the second generation Pinnacle Ridge processors. I fortunately didn't have any issues with RAM on my Ryzen system, but granted, I was using some Samsung B-die memory, and that did come at a premium. However, Ryzen just wasn't as flexible and easygoing with memory as Intel was. With 3rd gen, AMD are stating that configuring RAM and overclocking should be as easy as a one click. Since this time around, they've also designed the X570 chipset in-house rather than outsourcing it, like previous gens to ASMedia. They've literally borrowed Jensen's "it just works" catchphrase to showcase higher speeds, with DDR4 4200 MHz being easily attainable and 5133 having been demonstrated, which is absolutely astonishing, as 3600 MHz was pretty much the limit for the previous generation, and that was if you had gotten some really good B-die RAM and your CPU's IMC was golden quality. From their presentation slide, it looks like the sweet spot for price to performance is at the 3600 CL16 mark, where frequency is just high enough without latency getting hit too hard. And speaking of latency, it looks like there won't be any regression from the previous generation, as I know a lot of people were concerned due to how communication will be handled between 2 or 3 chiplets, and if that hinders performance in any way. It doesn't seem like it will be as low as what Intel has to offer on their mainstream parts, but that's just a trade-off we're probably going to have to live with, but chiplets will be the way forward due to being much more scalable. And since we're on the topic of latency, one of the ways AMD has mitigated this is by doubling the L3 cache, also known as game cache now. Not really a fan of that branding, but that's besides the point. Larger cache will help reduce latency with applications which puts a heavy load on the CPU, like games for example, as those types of applications will be juggling around information between cores, threads, and when that happens, you're bringing in multiple CCXs and chiplets into the mix through the Infinity Fabric, which can incur a latency penalty. Since we're also on the topic of the Infinity Fabric, AMD have also improved it in various ways as well. One of the major updates with IF2 is the support of PCI Express 4.0, and thus the increase of the bus width from 256-bit to 512-bit. The other thing they have done for the better, in my opinion, is that they have decoupled the Infinity Fabric clock from the DRAM clock. So originally on Zen 1 and Zen Plus, the Infinity Fabric would run at half the rate of your RAM. So by having faster memory, you could improve its performance as well, therefore reducing latency. This was something I covered in my 7 RAM speeds, 21 games tested on Ryzen. Now, there shouldn't be any drawbacks depending on the RAM you're using. You're not going to be limited with a slow kit as you were before. The faster bandwidth provided by Infinity Fabric 2 is what enables AMD to bring PCI Express 4.0, so those new NVMEs that are boasting speeds of up to 5 gigabytes per second, and their newer Navi-based graphics cards can take advantage of it. The other noteworthy piece of information I want to go over was that XFR and Precision Boost Overdrive will also continue to play a critical role in helping Ryzen sustain great performance under load, as they've been revamped as well, allowing the clocks to increase by up to 200 MHz depending on how good of a cooling solution you're using, motherboard power delivery, and so on. It really is a great auto overclocking feature if you don't want to do a manual OC, as it should give single-threaded performance a boost and help in improving gaming performance. The nice thing about PBO is that Robert Halleck recently cleared up this misconception that the boost algorithm only applied to one core. He mentions that Ryzen doesn't really have a single core turbo clock. The boost algorithm pursues the highest possible clocks on as many cores as possible until you hit some sort of limit pertaining to socket power, core temps, VRM, electrical and thermal limits, and so on. The really good thing about all of this is that thanks to the 7nm node, the processors are also very efficient with all these great enhancements. Along with all of the great hardware changes AMD have made for Zen 2 and Ryzen 3000 on the desktop, there have been some noteworthy changes made on the software side of things. All this great tech can't be taken advantage of if there's no software there to utilize it properly. The recent major Windows 10 update 1903 includes optimizations for the Windows scheduler on Ryzen-based systems. This was something that was brought up back when Ryzen was released in 2017. Windows hasn't worked really well with non-Intel based architectures. Zen is drastically different from Intel's mainstream parts. Two major optimizations will be included in the 1903 update. The first is topology awareness for Zen and Zen 2, where programs such as games, for example, will ensure that threads which need to be utilized are in the same CCX before the application will pass on information to a different thread that isn't in the same core complex or in the same chiplet. This was extremely crucial as programs that would only need to take advantage of 3 to 4 threads, for example, can easily attain stable performance by relying on one CCX instead of bouncing around information between multiple CCXs and different threads, incurring a latency penalty and so on. The really good thing about this is that not only will it be advantageous for Zen 2, but all Ryzen CPUs will benefit from this. The other enhancement this update will bring is called Ryzen Clock Selection. Basically, it allows the processor to switch between different P states more frequently and fluently. So those scenarios where the processor just needs a quick burst of performance, it should be able to do that a lot better now. Now, moving away from the whole architecture dive-in and improvements, a surprise announcement from AMD CEO Lisa Su at E3 2019, unveiling the world's first 16-core gaming CPU, the Ryzen 9 3950X. Now, of course, there have been 16-core parts released from both AMD and Intel in the past, which of course can game as well. But what they were highlighting here was the fact that this is the first 16-core CPU on AMD's mainstream platform, one that was only limited to 8 cores just over a year ago. On AM4, they have doubled the core and thread count possibility, and it was all thanks to their chiplet design and 7nm. Now, looking at the specs of the Ryzen 9 3950X, this CPU has a base and boost clock of 3.5 GHz and 4.7 GHz respectively, so it can definitely get up there and put up some numbers thanks to that high boost. 8 MB of L2 cache and 64 MB of L3 cache, and a 105 watt TDP, which, like I've mentioned before, don't take it as concrete, but that is astonishing. This thing is an absolute monster of a CPU. And with that, it will come at a fairly steep price. Obviously, this being their flagship Halo product, it's going to be $750. Never thought I'd see the day where we'd see a CPU that costs that much on a mainstream platform, but nonetheless, it's pretty much AMD just stabbing Intel in the chest at Computex with a knife, and now at E3 they're slowly twisting it as well. It's expensive, for sure, but it's not like 16-core products were targeted towards the masses to begin with. Only users whose workload really demands that much CPU power will be looking at this, where AMD has rest of the segments covered as well, and quite firmly at that. So as I said before, the Ryzen 3000 series processors have improved over the first and second gen processors in many ways, and drastically. Higher frequencies, higher IPC, doubling the core count, doubled L3 cache, better memory compatibility, and efficiency have been improved upon greatly. AMD have made another leap with Zen 2, which is rather astounding because they had made such a huge jump over Bulldozer back in 2017, just 2 years ago. It really pleases me to see AMD continuing to innovate like this in the CPU market, and pushing on ahead with new technologies and ways to revolutionize the market. When Intel was sitting comfortably ahead of AMD all those years ago, after they had released Sandy Bridge, what did they do? They stagnated the market, continued to feed us quad cores, and charged the same sky high prices for it. In 2016, a quad core with hyper-threading would have costed you somewhere around $350. To get an 8-core 16-thread processor, well, that was over $1,000. Now you can easily attain that for a fraction of the cost. But without going too far off a tangent, you've got some great options now. Mentioning all those improvements earlier is the reason why I believe that a third generation Ryzen processor really looks like a compelling upgrade for anyone with a first or even second gen Ryzen. Last year, prior to the release of the 2000 series, I made a video where I talked about whether or not first gen owners had any incentive to upgrade. There was no definite yes or no answer. For anyone who had been using a lower core count Ryzen CPU and wanted to upgrade down the road to a higher core count CPU, that would have been a totally justified reason. However, for someone like myself who had already been running an 8-core Ryzen CPU overclocked, running fast tuned memory, this is what I said. Going back to myself, I'm not going to completely eliminate the possibility of upgrading to a Ryzen Plus processor. If I can upgrade without hurting the wallet too much, sure, I'll consider it. I wouldn't expect any dramatic performance changes with my system if I did though. That's what I actually want from an upgrade, that brings greater noticeable improvements. That's why I'm more focused on Zen 2, which should deliver on my expectations of a larger leap in IPC and frequencies. A noticeable improvement is what I wanted, and a noticeable improvement is what I'll be getting with an upgrade to a 3rd gen processor. For someone that might be in a similar scenario, and wants to get something that's a step up, then AMD's Ryzen 9 3900X and 3950X look like a great upgrade. Especially if you have no need for a plethora of PCI Express lanes or quad-channel memory, you don't have to jump up to the Threadripper platform anymore. You can drop these CPUs into your current motherboard and call it a day. I'll be getting a 3900X on launch, and we'll be pairing that CPU with the Aorus Master X570 motherboard, and along with that, I decided to pick up some more BDI clocked at 3600MHz CL15. So you guys know I'll be spending a lot of time tweaking the system, running a lot of tests, which I'll be sharing with you guys of course, so stay tuned for a lot of benchmarks. But going back to the topic on hand, performance will improve all around. Jumping from a 1st gen Ryzen CPU to a 3rd gen, gaming performance will improve a lot. And that's important to me, as I run a 144Hz 1440p monitor, so high refresh rate gaming is essential. The other thing is that productivity and content creation apps will be able to go through projects quicker with 50% more cores and threads. Jumping from an 8-core to a 12-core processor, higher boost clocks, and possibly even more depending on how these new chips overclock, and having higher memory with better latency are just some things I'll be experiencing. This time around, it's not just users with lower core count quad cores who have the opportunity to upgrade that's justified, but also users with 8 cores have something to look forward to as well. Hey, and I can also see people with 8 cores 2700Xs and R7 1700s upgrading to another 8 core like the 3800X for example, because of the large leap in single core performance thanks to the increase in IPC and frequencies. But of course, I can't speak on behalf of you or dictate what you choose to do, only you can answer that question for yourself, and if your needs justify it. All I'm saying is that you've got some great options now and a really good upgrade path is set up for you. Well guys, if you found this video to be informative and helpful, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description for my other videos and ways to support the channel. If you guys wanted to see more content like this, then make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.